Hello, and welcome to another edition of Brussels Sprouts. I'm Andrea Kendall Taylor,
And I'm Jim Townsend.
and we're so glad you can join us. Last Sunday, on February 23rd, Germany held parliamentary elections that are set to usher in a new political era for the country. Following the collapse of Olaf Scholz's fascist coalition last fall, the Conservatives are set to regain power after all three parties in the previous government had poor showings in the election. At the same time, the far right Alternative for Germany, or AfD, had its best electoral result ever, capturing 20% of the vote and finishing as the second largest party in the Bundestag. This domestic shift is taking place against the backdrop of massive turmoil within Europe and the transatlantic relationship, spurred by the Trump administration's antagonism toward its allies and rapprochement with Russia. And so, to help us make sense of Germany's election results, the coalition negotiations to come, and the broader implications for Europe, we're very pleased to have Jeff Rathke and James Angelos with us on the podcast today. Jeff and James, welcome.
Pleasure to be with you.
Quick introductions. Jeff is the president of the American German Institute at the Johns Hopkins University in Washington, D.C., and James is Germany news editor at Politico, having been based in Berlin for over a decade. So, James, since you're there on the ground and in Germany, maybe we'll start with you and have you give us your overview of the election and what transpired. Really helpful to know what the main issues were in this election, what you think drove Sunday's results, and what, if anything, you found surprising or notable.
Yeah, first of all, thanks for having me. So the uh, major issues ahead of the election were domestic, notably domestic ahead of time, and it was even as all these the Trump administration came in, and there was all this questioning of the transatlantic alliance, these kind of radical shifts in the rhetoric coming from the U.S. in terms of Ukraine. The conversation really here was domestically focused. So it was the economy, um, and it was migration. And Germany's economy has been stagnating for years now, and migration is the sort of perennial issue, and it really um, ahead of the vote was the conservatives really made that one of their prime issues.
And would you say, I mean, there were a couple of really notable things that happened in close proximity to the election, obviously, that observers were paying quite a lot of attention to. So, number one was JD Vance's speech at the Munich Security Conference, and the way that they were kind of putting their finger on the scale and meeting with the leaders um, uh, of the AfD, and also the migration issue. Just before the Munich Security Conference was the major incident where someone drove in pedestrians in Munich. So, do you think that either of those events had any bearing on the outcome of the election?
There have been a series in German domestic sphere. There's been a series of these kinds of attacks, high-profile attacks perpetrated or accused, blamed on people who are asylum seekers, and that really there was an attack on a Christmas market around during Christmas time. There was a um, in Bavaria another sort of dreadful attack in January. So there's been this kind of drumbeat of these things that are in the back of people's minds, and that I'm sure had an outcome on the election. And the AfD obviously tried to use those attacks to sort of hammer the conservatives. And the one shift that did take place is that the conservatives even expressed a willingness to work or to accept the support of the AfD to pass tough migration measures. So that was really a lot of the conversation ahead of the election, which the conservatives won. The AfD came in second, as you said. But the the Munich Security Conference speech, I mean that had, if you listen to Friedrich Merz, who's going to be the next chancellor and who conservatives won the election, if you listen to his rhetoric about the transatlantic alliance ahead of that speech, it was very much boilerplate transatlantic alliance. We believe in it. He's a transatlanticist to his core. And then once that speech took place, there was a drastic shift in his rhetoric. You could see it really hit him. He, yeah, and after the election, he said some of the night after he won, he pretty much on German television said, we need independence, was the word he used, from the US. We need to be sort of prepared for um, um, uh, the possibility that NATO is not going to be the protective force for us and for Europe that it has been. So these were, you could see that he was clearly affected by it. I'm not sure if the German electorate was listening to the Munich Security Conference and being that influenced by it, though.
Yeah, I don't know if it's true anecdotally. I feel like I had heard that it might have actually had kind of the opposite effect where people were so kind of disdainful about, foreign interference in the election and the United States weighing in that way that it might have had an unintended consequence. How measurable it was, I don't know.
Yeah.
But Jeff, if you step back and look at the election, what were your big takeaways? What do you think is most notable? What do people need to understand about this election?
Yeah. Well, thanks for the invitation, and I agree with James's point about, in particular, the fact that security policy and Germany's relationship with the United States really didn't play much of a role in the campaign. But there has been this shift since election day. And I just want to read out the quotation from Friedrich Merz, who is as close as you can come to kind of a dyed in the wool transatlanticist in a German context as you could imagine. And his quotation that evening in this television session. It's kind of an interesting thing, actually. All of the leaders of all the parties get together for a television broadcast, a live interview, the night of the election. And sometimes the tensions are quite high, and sometimes you don't even know exactly who's won. So it's an interesting institution. Anyway, Friedrich Merz said, "For me, it will be an absolute priority to strengthen Europe as fast as possible so that we really achieve independence from the US step by step." I would never have thought that I would have to say something like that in a television broadcast. But at the latest, since the statements in the past week from Donald Trump, it is clear that America, this government, is largely indifferent to the fate of Europe. So he's walked that back a little bit, and he hasn't said it in quite such direct and compelling terms. But what you see happening since then is the Social Democrats, who are likely to be the partner in government with Merz and the CDU and the CSU, um, they're talking about how they might restock the so-called special fund, which was created to recapitalize the Bundeswehr just after Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022, and other measures that will put Germany's role in European security on a new plane. Um, and they're thinking about doing this even in what would be like the equivalent of a lame duck session. In other words, before the new Bundestag takes office in 30 days, you can still reconvene the current Bundestag, which is where they have enough of a majority to pass a constitutional amendment and create a new special fund. So that gets a little bit down in the weeds about Germany's debt brake and all of these other things. But it's interesting to observe how quickly the German political system is reacting. Also, I think it's notable that Emmanuel Macron, when he was on his way to the United States to meet with President Trump, he made calls from the plane with Olaf Scholz and with Friedrich Merz. So there is a degree of coordination that is already happening. Now, as to the lessons or the outcomes of the election, to get back to your question, Andrea, there's first of all the way in which the governing parties were shellacked is remarkable. It was a uniquely unpopular government for some reasons we might get into, and the fact that the center right only got 28% of the vote, running against an extremely the most unpopular government in German history, is important. This was not a triumph for Friedrich Merz. They eked out a victory where they will probably be able to form a two-party government, and that's pretty good given the way the result looked. And then to come back to the other point that you raised, The United States government really tried to put their thumb on the scale in this election. You had the vice president's speech. You've mentioned it. He met, as you also said, with the leader and the top candidate of the AfD in Munich when he didn't meet with the German chancellor. For example, whether that was a scheduling issue or not is there's still some debate about that.
There seem to
Uh,
be a lot of scheduling issues going on, as I just met with Kaya Kallas, who had a scheduling issue with Rubio. So
yeah,
the Europeans are finding themselves in with a
yeah.
lot of these issues.
And so I think there's 2 points here. One is the United States clearly under the Trump administration wants to influence European politics, wants to empower the far right, and parties that have a fundamentally, anti-European, anti-EU view. But then it's a different question of whether they're actually able to do it, because despite the promotion on X, formerly Twitter, by Elon Musk and his endorsement of the AfD and JD Vance's steps, the needle didn't move for the AfD. They were at 20, 21, 22% in the polls for months, despite three major attacks, as James outlined, that had a connection to migrants. Despite the U.S. government, it didn't change things. So uh, the I think the focus now is on figuring out what is the ceiling. It may be low, but it's somewhere above 20%, but maybe not much above 20% for the far right at the moment, depending on how things develop in the coming years.
I know Jim's going to be chomping at the bit to get to kind of the security implications, but really quickly before we go there, James, I did want to pick up on the AFD question. Do you think this about 20% is the ceiling for the AFD? And how are people interpreting their performance? Some people, is it a glass half empty or a glass half full? Because some people will say it's the biggest outcome, the best results that they've ever received at 20%. And then other people will say it was a resounding defeat of the AfD. 80% of Germans voted against them. So which is it?
I would I would look at it with a long-term view. If you look at the party's performance over time, it is risen starkly, and it's doubled its presence in the Bundestag, doubled its vote percentage. It's now, from my perspective, in a very good position. You have a not so grand coalition. A grand coalition in German context is the uh, the conservative alliance in line with the center left social democrats. So, back in the old days of German politics, that wasn't a common outcome. Now it seems to be the only way you can form a government with keeping out the far right. So then the question is, how sustainable is this model where you have basically the two centrist parties, and then they're being hammered from the outside by the far right. And over time, I think that has a very corrosive effect on the democracy because you lose the choice that you normally had between two sort of parties that had different policies, and they sort of become the spectrum becomes the center or the mainstream or the establishment versus the insurgent parties. So I think the question here is what happens then the next time there's an election, and I think that the AfD will do its best um, to hammer the two centrist parties, and they may come out even weaker next time around. But it's there are these big these big issues that the economy um, is a big one, and the Ukraine is also a big one. This fear in the back of people's minds, this war will escalate, and the AfD answer is, let's foster closer ties to the Kremlin. So after if this continues, uh, this line of attack or this kind of message may become more effective over time.
Teeny little question, Jeff. And then, Jim, I promise it's all over to you. What about the far left?
Far left is an interesting story, and I think you have to distinguish there because the far left split about a year ago, And so you had a new party formed by one of the more charismatic leaders on the left, a woman named Sarah Wagenknecht, who's been in German politics for 30 years. It came out of the East German Communist Party context, and has been a presence for a long time. She formed her own party. They did pretty well in the European Parliament elections, did very well in the East German state elections in the second half of 2024, and they looked like they were going to be in a way almost the counterpart on the far left to the AfD on the far right. Well, didn't turn out that way. They sort of imploded. They finished just below the 5% threshold, so they won't be represented in the Bundestag. But the other interesting thing that happened on the far left is that the traditional left party, from which Sarah Wagenknecht split off, they surged. In a way, they were almost liberated from this polarizing figure at their who had a very nationalist view on certain things, especially migration, trying to pick up on that populist sentiment. So, stripped of that element, the traditional far left did really well, finished just under 9%. And so that means by the way, they were among the biggest beneficiaries of the youth vote. So if you want to look at where the young people are going, they got a disproportionate amount of their support from young voters. So that means, as a result, that in this coming Bundestag, between the far left and the far right AfD, they will have the ability to block constitutional changes, which are important for reforming the debt brake and other things that might come up. So that is a significant development.
Oh, it's so interesting.
Can I make one point there that I
Oh, of
think?
course.
Yeah.
And then it goes to Jim.
Yes, Jim. So the Wagenknecht party that Jeff was referring to lost out by 13,000 votes of making it into parliament. In Germany, you have a 5% threshold. You need to get at least 5% of the vote to make it into parliament ordinarily. This is to prevent the kind of fragmentation that was that defined the Weimar Republic. So they just by 13,000 votes didn't make it in. But the larger effect of that is that if they had made it in, Merz and the Conservatives would have needed a three-party coalition. They would have been forced to also be in a coalition with the Greens, so two center-left parties. And that would have made the government weaker even now. So that was just we were up very late on election night to see whether Wagenknecht would make it in that party, that sort of populist left party. Not because we were so interested in that party as much as we were interested in the effect it would have on the next government.
Wow. So by the skin of their teeth, the two-party coalition.
Yeah, and I think I think that those 13,000 votes will have a huge impact on the next several 4 years.
Okay, Jim, it's your moment.
Well, thanks. And it's great to have you
That
guys.
was a snoring sound, just in case anyone didn't understand what that sound was.
I'm offended that we put Jim to sleep.
No, actually, I'm very excited. This is just great. That was my excited sound. This is really great. But Jeff, great to see you, old friend from many days working together in the interagency. So I want to take us back a little bit to some definitions, just because I think for a lot of our listeners, we have a pretty large group, both in the U.S. but also in Europe, to talk a little bit about the AfD and the Greens, because I think we've watched the AfD change, or at least morph a little bit, or try to remake themselves from what their original. I mean, they were started off as a protest group early on, protesting immigration and migration and the economics of that. And they've evolved over time. And so when you talk about an AfD in the U.S., people say, "Oh, those Nazis." Well, there's that element, I guess, are still in that DNA somewhere. But what is the AfD today that we are looking at? The AfD that did so well. So what are they now? If you're going to describe them to an American audience, what are the AfD now? And on the other side, the Greens. The Greens and their DNA. They've been eco-terrorists. They've been far left. Then all of a sudden they became respectable. All of a sudden they got into the government and they became hawks on foreign policy and Ukraine. So tell us a little bit who the AFD is and we are and how they've morphed. And then the Greens, what does the election mean for them? What have they become? And where are they going in terms of a party? Are they still going to be eco terrorists, or are they what are they now becoming in German politics?
Okay, so I'll be happy to have James's help on this as well. But to start with the AFD, there are two contradictory statements one can make about the AFD. First of all, it has become more extreme over time. If you look at the positions that the AFD occupies and represents now, and at the personalities who play the leading roles in shaping their message, they are more extreme. They have a tendency to play on, um, in some cases, banned expressions from the Nazi era, and at the same time, they have become more popular. Now, it's not that they've become more popular because they are touching these taboos in all cases. A lot of their support, as James was also talking about, was they were going up against an unpopular government and a German political spectrum where the middle has become a lot more muddled, and the distinctions between parties have become the edges of that have been softened and erased almost in certain cases. But the AfD, if you look at Germany's domestic intelligence service, which has a role in ensuring that there is no, that never again is a part of Germany's political ethos. They have categorized a number of the state level parties of the AfD as verifiably right wing extremist. Um, that stops short of a ban, but it does enable them to use certain, constitutional means to observe and to keep an eye on the AfD. So, there is a frustration in the AfD with what they consider Germany's memory culture to be. There, you have leaders who talk about, how the fact that not all SS officers were bad, and so forth. So there is, they are dancing around the most taboo issues in Germany's history and that have formed the core of Germany's post-war rehabilitation and integration into Europe and the world community. And they do that, in a consistent, progressively, I would put it that way. The Greens, not eco-terrorists. Since 1998, they've been in government. They've been in the parliament for 40 years. I mean, the Greens voted for the NATO in favor of Germany participating in the NATO action against Yugoslavia during the Kosovo war. So this is a fundamentally anchored party in the mainstream of the political spectrum, but they've suffered from a backlash against what many people perceive to be climate policies that suppress German growth or that were changing things too quickly. The Greens, that's a whole. We could do another hour on that one, but that would be my short answer.
That was comprehensive, James. You can feel free to add anything to that. But in this last kind of segment of the podcast, I also really want to talk about now implications for foreign policy, for Ukraine, German leadership in Europe. As you have said, Merz is set to become chancellor. Both of you have touched on the great irony of this transatlanticist having to chart a more independently European course. What can you tell us about what you think Merz's priorities will be kind of on this foreign policy side? It's notable that Schultz really was in lockstep with President Biden on a very slow and cautious approach in many ways to Ukraine. Do you think that's going to change under Merz?
Yes. Short answer, yes. I think, I mean, he was Merz was very critical of Schultz for being too hesitant on aid for Ukraine. Germany never sent long-range Taurus missiles to Ukraine, whereas the U.S., France, and Germany, I'm sorry, U.S., France, and UK did send their own cruise missiles or long-range missiles. So I think there was that was sort of this Schultz's way of saying, like, I'm helping a lot. Schultz's message was basically, I'm helping a lot, but I know where the red lines are, and I know where to stop, and I know how to prevent this war from escalating. Whereas Merz was more like, we need to be tougher, we need to stop sowing kind of fear in the German population of escalation. We need to deliver those missiles. Now that Trump is called so much of the transatlantic alliance into question, I think as Jeff already pointed out, one of the big discussions now is whether they will push through a sort of major defense spending package in the current parliament in order to, this is a combination of things happening here. You have um, the next parliament will have the far left and the far right parties who'd be able to block military spending for different reasons, but they would be potentially aligned on that. So combined with the the transatlantic relationship being in peril, you have them now pushing to get a big defense, potentially a huge defense spending package through right away in the next weeks. So we'll see if that actually transpires, but that's the level of urgency now. And I think, you know, Jeff also alluded to this the day after Merz made these statements about, independence for Germany from, or for Europe from US in terms of defense. He did walk it back a bit, and I found it interesting. He's still going to try to preserve the alliance. He's still going to try to sort of cut deals with Trump to get Trump on his good side. He's mentioned buying fighter jets as one F-35s to sort of to please Donald Trump. So he's going to try to be transactional as well. And in fact, what I found interesting about election night was Donald Trump actually congratulated the conservatives and tried to claim the victory, sort of, to say, this is part of my movement. He's like, this is crackdown on immigration, and this is part of the movement. But then if you watch what Merz said, he's calling the whole relationship into question. So you could also see Merz there being, he's just been elected chancellor, and just from a purely, he seemed to be speaking from the heart, but from a purely tactical perspective, he may have wanted to accept those congratulations if he's trying to get on Trump's good side. So the European leaders are in this very strange position where they're trying to, what can we do to make this guy happy? It's not the basis on which they want to have an alliance, obviously, but desperate times call for desperate measures.
Yeah. So Jeff, you can add to that. And it is notable, Scholz and Macron didn't get along particularly well. Scholz was very much aligned with Biden. Talk to us maybe about your expectations for Merz's relationship with Macron. As you mentioned, Macron was on the phone on the way over. So there seems to be like maybe more, I don't know, maybe more alignment, or maybe that's just out of necessity, given that Europe is finding itself, in this adversary camp. So it is necessitating greater alignment. But yeah, to add to what James said about your expectations on Ukraine, kind of foreign policy, and who do you think Merz will be looking to align with, create coalitions with? Will we see a resumption of the famous Franco-German engine?
Right. So I think Merz spoke about this on a number of occasions during the campaign, and we can expect not only a close working partnership with France. It will be complicated, but Merz, I believe, has already has visited France. I haven't seen a readout of those discussions, but that is going to be at the heart of it. But Merz went out of his way during the campaign to say as well that Germany needed to create a sort of, core of major European countries. It can't rely only on the relationship with France. So I think you can expect to see Poland in that mix, Italy, where Giorgia Meloni is perhaps the European leader with the greatest kind of credibility or entree with the Trump administration, probably with maybe the Scandinavians, the Nordic countries, I mean, and others, as well as the UK. So I think Merz wants to create a sort of contact group like arrangement where the major European players can coordinate among themselves, and not be divided by perhaps the tactics of the Trump administration, which might want to limit the European solidarity there. So I think that's very likely to happen. Now, how this will, I think we can also expect Germany's support to Ukraine to continue in coordination with European powers. They will want and see a reason to strengthen Zelensky as much as they can so that he is not forced to accept a bad deal that would then accelerate the risks to German and European security if Ukraine's independence and sovereignty is erased from the map as Russia would like it to be. So there's a core self-interest there as well, which I think is going to drive this. And then overall, I think they will want to mollify Washington as much as they can while they scramble to make up for lost time and put European security on a more sustainable basis that is less vulnerable, less exposed to the risk of US disengagement. How quickly they can do that, how much they can spend, what Germany's industrial capacity is to fulfill those demands, those are all going to be the major battlegrounds politically where Merz, with in getting a budget passed and in creating working relationships with his European counterparts that are going to be crucial.
That was going to be my next question, which is, I mean, this it may be a little bit of a bright spot, a positive that Merz is in. He seems to have a lot of energy. He seems to be very focused and intentional and clear about the direction of travel. But James, the question, I mean, as Jeff was just saying, are the resources there? I mean, my understanding is the German economy is not in an excellent shape or an excellent position. And how much public appetite will there be to make hard choices that will be required to fuel those investments in defense and other things that now seem so critical?
That I think that is the key question. But on the first issue of in terms of spending, the Germans have this peculiar restraint on spending. It's a constitutionally anchored restriction on spending, put in place during Angela Merkel's chancellorship in 2009 among the European debt crisis. So this is why Germans can't do major spending like the kind that they looks like they have to on defense without uh, going without amending the constitution in some way or voting for a special fund, which needs a two-thirds majority. So this is you have these. This is a historical moment, a pivotal moment in post-war history of Germany. Um, Yet you have these kind of some if you listen to the domestic debate is rather like do we spend 2% or 2.5%, or it's very kind of incremental, and you get the impression that they haven't fully grasped the seriousness of the moment. On the other uh, issue is who's going to we're talking about a society that is essentially talking about militarizing, and so who here is going to enlist? And this is it's not a society that has been bred on, especially following the Cold War. It's been peace dividend. It's been uh, comfortable. It has enjoyed American protection, and this has kind of created this particular, yeah, a pacifist streak. I wouldn't maybe not go that far, but in any case, it's not sort of the standard behavior to join the military. It's not as self understood as it is in other countries, like in the United States. So there was a report by this think tank in Brussels called Bruegel that's put an estimate on how many troops the Europeans would need to replace U.S. protection. They said it would be the equivalent of 300,000 U.S. troops. It would be more in European terms. And the question, who are the soldiers going to be? And so I think there's a larger question of whether German society is sort of prepared for this scale of replacing U.S. protection. And if it's able to do it, it's a sort of a generational task. It's not something that can be done by the end of the decade, and it's something that would be a long-term shift.
If I can jump in here, like a good example of this is conscription. Germany suspended conscription a little over 10 years ago. And there have been moves, including by the current defense minister, Boris Pistorius, who suggested reintroducing conscription in some way. He got brushed back hard by his own party, and so he had to water down those proposals. But there are proposals, um, you know, i- in draft legislation which could be revived quickly. The CDU and CSU are more favorable toward this idea. So I think one of the early indications to look for is whether the resumption of conscription in some form, or at least of registering people and of giving them an opportunity to carry out service, it becomes part of the security policy response. Certainly, Germany has armed forces of about 181, 182,000 people. They intend to grow that by 25,000, but they are not on track to do so. So they have a problem in generating mass that has not been solved by the traditional approaches. So if they do want to have their own role in a strengthened European conventional force posture, then they're going to need to do something much more radical than what they've done up to now.
Yeah, excellent points. Last question, and before we wrap, and something I've been thinking about, wondering about, is if the United States is talking about normalizing relations with Russia. As part of that, I would imagine there would be a removal of many of the sanctions. President Trump is talking about US businesses returning to Russia, minerals deals, energy deals. What does Germany do in that case? I mean, will businesses be content to not return to Russia and let American businesses have the upper hand and benefit from this new relationship? Or has that tie been so irreparably severed that that's not an option? And then on the flip side, you know, part of the question is then, well, what does that mean for Germany's relations with China? So if the United States is cozying up to Russia, I've heard already that the Chinese officials are making all the right and friendly noises, kind of trying to saddle in, hey Europeans. What does that look like from Berlin?
Oh, those are all great questions to which I have no answers. I mean, the I do think in the German psyche there's this belief, this hope that relations with Russia will be restored at some point in the future. They want to turn those Nord Stream pipelines back on at some point, uh, and um, they want they want a resumption of the relationship, but not under the current circumstances. And I think um, that would obviously put the government in an extremely difficult position, the way you framed the question about how German businesses would respond to this. But I think that would eventually push the Europeans into a closer. It would force the Europeans to take a stronger posture. Um,
I see two things kind of on the horizon. One is near term, one is longer term. Andrea, the first thing is EU sanctions. These have to be. There have been, I think, 16 packages of EU sanctions since the Russian invasion in 2022, and those remain in effect until June, when they would need to be rolled over. And the United States can't force the Europeans to lift sanctions. Now, there might be a competitive aspect where Europeans say, well, we're worried about the Americans getting in and taking a privileged position or something. But I think the inertia of the path that Europe has been on toward Russia with the sanctions is pretty powerful. So that would be one thing. Do the sanctions get renewed in June? And then
Well, countries like Hungary will obviously make that hard also. Right?
yeah, that's right. But they've gone along with the rollover up to now, and the big EU countries have leverage over Hungary in other ways. So it's unclear how that would shake out.
Yep.
And then the longer term, like it's a domestic political question. Merz, as well as the SPD and the Greens, all the mainstream parties have been extremely critical of Russia, and I think that would also be an impediment to near-term actions that would simply revert to a business as usual posture. Reopening Nord Stream 2, for example, under the existing regime in Russia, would seem like folly, and I think there would be a lot of resistance to it. But there's a bigger problem, as James pointed out. Germany's been economically stagnant for about 5-6 years, and so they need a growth impetus, and China is not serving that purpose, because China's become more competitive with Germany, especially in the big high value added sectors where Germany used to dominate and make tons of money in China. And so they have some very fundamental decisions to make about how they make the German economy more competitive. And do they play into the hands of China, which is really trying to hollow out the areas that have been most beneficial to Germany economically over the last 20 years or so?
Well, this has been great. And lest anyone think that we totally sidelined Jim, we got to announce that we lost him. I think his connection cut out or something much earlier in the conversation. So I didn't hog the whole thing. But James and Jeff, this was really excellent. I feel like this is maybe a little bit of a bright spot in a lot of the dialogues and discussions and all of the things happening, that, that there'll be some energy and clear direction, like I said, coming from Germany. And I hope I'm right, but I think I'm very thankful to both of you for helping us make sense and understand what happened in these elections and what it means for the future. So look forward to checking back in with you, hopefully, several months in after we've got a coalition, and as we see things taking shape. It would be great to have both of you back.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Brussels Sprouts, brought to you by the Transatlantic Security Team at the Center for a New American Security. You can find all of our previous episodes wherever you get your podcasts. And please remember to rate and review Brussels Sprouts so that new listeners are able to find the show.